Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is Tom Ricks, and I will be talking to you today. So today is kind of an experiment, or rather the result of an experiment, where for a long time, as an independent author, I've been thinking, how can I get people to review my book? Or how can I get people to pay attention to my book? I've come up with a ton of different ideas and read a ton of ideas, and, it's not easy. For a lot of reasons, some of which because there's a lot of scam artists out there, and I'm experienced enough at that I'm not even going to go into that. You should, if you are interested in becoming an independent author, definitely research all of the people out there trying to make money off of you in really unscrupulous ways. But long story short of it, the money should only change hands in one of two ways. Either you are paying somebody to do something for you specifically that you have total rights and total control over, like the cover of your book, or whoever it is that is doing the podcast, or whoever's doing the audiobook, and you hold all the rights and you hold all the cards, or you are paying them to do publicity for your book, like Fiverr, and I'll get to that in a moment, or they are paying you. And even then, especially if you're involved in the kind of genres that I typically am, the best example I can think of is to go to SFWA, or the Science Fiction Writers Association, where they will give you the ins and outs of what kinds of rights are industry standard, and what rates are professional. And it's perfectly reasonable to earn less than that when you're just starting out, but you should know, if you're being paid peanuts for rights, that you could otherwise retain yourself as an independent author. Now, getting back to the Fiverr thing, I've used Fiverr for a number of different things on my books. It's not just $5 anymore. Originally, the site was you had to have something that you pay $5 for, and that was it. You paid $5 and you got something, hence the name. But since then, it's really more of almost a Craigslist and a job site with a built-in thing, and that's how I found quite a few people to do quite a few things for me in my creative projects. In particularly Rachel Bostwick, who did the fantastic illustrations for the cover of both Grenade Man vs. the Zombies and Have Name Will Travel. I thought about a lot about how I was going to do this, and I've decided that I'm going to basically review 3 books today. One of mine, one of someone else's, and a hybrid. So I'll explain that in a moment. I was recently unemployed, so as an effort to raise funds, I created a Fiverr ad, both in a hope to get some income and in an attempt to hopefully promote other authors that might somehow promote me. The idea was the quote, a rising tide lifts all boats. I am going to probably deactivate that ad. It was a noble experiment, but I think that ultimately I don't want this podcast to be about earning money. Or rather, it's perfectly fine earning money for me, and it's perfectly fine earning money for anybody else I want to use it as a platform to shout out to. But I think the nature of Fiverr will change it. However, I took one contract for the book that I'm about to review, and also one for the bumper at the end. So I do actually recommend that. I think for the right reader, both of these books are interesting. And I'll go into a little bit of details on both. The first book that I'm going to talk about, which is the one that, in full disclosure, I've received $25 to read and review. I do want to clarify that after talking with the author, I'm going to be doing it in Edgar Allan Poe fashion, who also took money to review books, but did it on his own terms. And Scott Gurney, who is the writer of the first book, Anchor, that I'm going to be talking about, was perfectly fine with that, which I admire, because that explains both confidence in his work and also a willingness to accept the truth. So let's get started on that one, and then I'll go to a couple of other books that I want to talk about, which were not paid for and are entirely of my own recognizance, one of which is my book. So the book Anchor, I'm going to start with the spoiler-free version, and then we're going to go into the spoiler version, because I think this is a very difficult book to properly review without having some spoilers involved. The spoiler-free version is that this is a book that is, in my opinion, very difficult to quantify in terms of genre. Specifically, I would say that it's a little bit sci-fi action thriller, like maybe the Andromeda Strain, and a little bit literary Rubik's Cube, like maybe Infinite Jest or Ulysses, and a little bit existential crisis, existential surrealism, or even maybe magical realism, like some of the works of Kurt Vonnegut. Now, those are all very high standards, and Anchor, on a scale of 1 to 10, to me falls between somewhere in a 7 and an 8, in terms of reaching the highest of each of those particular genres. I think that this is a book for someone that enjoys something esoteric, that enjoys something that is well written but might be difficult to read, and that is very much a challenge. So now I'm gonna go a little bit into spoiler territory. I think the biggest thing for me about this book was the first third. For me, was very difficult to get into. It doesn't really have what a lot of writers refer to as a hook, which is something that immediately grabs the writer. At times, I found it a little bit difficult to know what the narrator's perspective was, or who was the narrator, or what I should be reading about the narrator. And while the initial blurb that Scott sent me talked about the fact that this was an attempt to challenge the perceptions of personality, and quite a few, I'm having difficulty immediately finding the blurb he sent me, but the point is that this is definitely a book that makes you think, and it's definitely a book that explores the concept of what is consciousness and the definition of self. So the difficulties on that made sense, because as you go into the book, you understand that the primary protagonist is involved in some technologies that in the 1960s messed around with things that they should not have messed around with, and unleashed essentially a kind of an ego monster, a parasite that goes from person to person. I think the biggest challenge for this book is the fact that Scott regularly uses very, very long paragraphs with no break, and sometimes there is literally no carriage return between different characters. Having gotten through the book at this point, I now understand that I believe that was a conscious choice to highlight the fact that one consciousness of an individual is often bleeding into another, and there are whole passages of the book where he literally spends time in the consciousness of another. Initially, before I found out what was going on, I think I was going to say the best selling point for this book to me was going to be Not what it was originally sold to me as, but a fascinating portrait of what it's like to be someone who is really intelligent in a world of people who are not intelligent. The writing style and the vocabulary is very much something that reminds me of the literature at the turn of the century in the 19th century. Very elevated, very interesting. Scott does have a very good writing style, but I think the challenge is that I think he needs to do a much better job of telling people what it is and how it's written up front, without necessarily spoiling all of the mysteries that are inside of it. The truth is that this technology has always been interesting to me because, in Black Mirror, again, spoilers coming, there's a book called, there's a well-known, and lots of people are already aware of it, but I wanted to make sure that there were spoilers, a spoiler warning, called Black Mirror, where in the first episode of the fourth season, called the USS McAllister, where there's a digital transfer of intelligence. And, I was always dubious about that technology. But for me, that show was kind of the Frankenstein of the digital transfer of intelligence. And, I don't care if it lets me live for a million years. And I'm actually very much a transhumanist. I believe in allowing individuals to enhance themselves cybernetically or digitally. It's just not for me, because I will never trust or tolerate the potential abuse that something like that could do to my consciousness. As a general rule, I try and be kind to my past or present or future selves, or if I ever interacted with them, alternate universes selves, just because I think that that's what you should do, and that's a personal choice. But I would never inflict a version of me on a malicious individual. Having been raised in a religious environment with what I believe to be malevolent deity, I would never put a version of me in that circumstances. And, a version, like I said, there's another quote I like in one of Stephen King's Gunslinger books towards the end, again, spoilers, where at one point, two of the characters are talking about literally the concept of genre. The latter three books of The Gunslinger are very metafictional, very self-referential. Stephen King is one of the few writers who actually puts himself in a novel and gets away with it in a way that's tasteful. The only other one I can think of is Heinlein in The Number of the Beast. And at one point they're talking about how, people like to put certain stories in little holes, little pegs, because it's easier for them to understand what the rules are. Several very good books I've read indicate that supporting characters should always do the same thing. In fact, when I got feedback from one of my own novels that I'm working on called Heir of Sunfire, one of the things I was told is this story does not fit the hero's journey. And it doesn't. It definitely does not. But then again, if you read some of the old fairy tales, they don't necessarily fit the hero's journey either. For those of you not aware, the hero's journey is a thing that is referenced in the brilliant work by Joseph Campbell called the Mask, or the Hero of a Thousand Faces, where he goes to all kinds of myths and finds common points in those stories, and it was tremendously influential on a number of different writers, and among them George Lucas when he created Star Wars, especially the first Star Wars. And there's a thing that the hero's journey does, and it's okay to break the rules, but it is very much, if you're going to be a writer, something you need to know, because you can't, in my opinion, properly break the rules until you're at least able to follow them. Mainly because those rules are there for a reason, and it's because they've been very successful time and time again. And people break the rules and get away with it all the time. But if you don't know how to do the rules, if you don't know what the rules are properly, in proper context and what they are, breaking them is either going to be an accidental success, or you're probably going to do it badly. Scott's work breaks a lot of rules, but I think it does it overall well. I just think he's needs to find a better way to sell his book, and I can't immediately say what that is. But it does, and definitely, in my opinion, in Frankenstein light horror fashion, demonstrate the dangers of digital, well, in this case, very much analog, almost psi, transfer of consciousness, and in a very interesting way ask the question of what is consciousness. And, there's another book that I read which, to me, raised a lot of those similar questions, called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which very much tells things from the perspective of an autistic child. And having read that, it really made me question the existence of my own consciousness. I've done a little bit of research into this, and I intend to do more, but there's a lot of people that think that consciousness is almost an accident, that it's kind of this illusion. We like to think that as organisms, the I in our mind is the most important thing that there is, and that we essentially exist because of that consciousness. But, there's a lot of organisms that if they have a consciousness, it's only barely operational. Although the antithesis of that, and I'll probably be getting into that in a future podcast, is there are a lot more creatures, at least 10 or 20 species that I can think of right off the top of my head, that almost assuredly have sapience equivalent to at least human children, and certainly in certain cases approaching more than most people I've met. So on the whole, I think that Anchor is worth reading. I think it's an interesting book, and I think that it was a noble experiment. I'm glad I read it, but this will probably be the last one of those kinds of reviews that I'm doing on my podcast. I might review books, and I will probably still find beginning authors. In fact, if you are a beginning author or know a beginning author, you are more than welcome to send them my way, redanvilcreative@gmail.com, and send me a copy of the book. And I will, if in my own schedule and my own time, get around to reviewing it. But I'm not going to be doing it on Fiverr anymore. So having said that, there's a couple of other books I want to talk about. One of which is called High Midnight by Rob Mosca. I wrote a review for it. And in the interest of saving time, and because as you know, I in this podcast kind of go back and forth, I think I'm probably just going to read my review because I think I did a really good job with that. This book, High Midnight, is an excellent read and masterfully crafted. For being his first novel, Rob Mosca seems to have harnessed magic in words. He has an intuitive sense of pacing and makes an image in your mind of exactly what is going on without being bogged down by excessive details. In truth, if there was a literary opposite of the works of Faulkner, High Midnight is such work. Not that Faulkner is excessive in his details, rather High Midnight hits the sweet spot in my personal spectrum. The genre, as I would call it, it's stew, again referencing what I referred to in the Song of Susanna, would be a mix of many genres, but it does not break the fourth wall, unlike the Song of Susanna. To give you an idea of how much I like the book, I'm adding it to my permanent library. Something only gets on that shelf if it is something that I'm going to read more than once, and I assure you I will be reading this again, which I have. Some books are page-turners that you only get a proper sense of the second or third time you read them. Which is also true, because honestly I got a lot more out of the book when I listened to the excellent audio book version, also done by a friend of mine, Bernard Sotero Clark, who performed it, and it's available on Audible. Theme-wise, the phrase High Midnight is an excellent choice, since the original Western upon which the name is based, High Noon, is a good mirroring point. Though the townsfolk of Unity, Texas, are not quite as craven as those in Haleyville, the pattern still remains the same. A lone sheriff defending what is right and good against impossible and deadly odds, despite the fact that he has personal interests not to. There's a strong sense of good and evil, properly shadowed by postmodern shades of gray. Evil is evil, but it is not cartoon evil. Good is good, but it is not slovenly harrowed good. Well, okay, that cartoon evil is not entirely correct, but for the most part it is. I speak, of course, of Mooseburger, who I feel is the true protagonist. Now, most people would regard Sheriff Laredo as the true hero of the story, and while it is true that he is definitely a figure They would feel right at home in any Western UK care to name, perhaps sans Mexican wrestling mask. No literary critique would be complete without a complete mangling of the original intent of the author. This is why I feel that it is really Moosburger's story, a large, misunderstood man-child who possesses extraordinary strength and physical resilience. His spoilers. It is his choice that makes the difference in the story. It is his decision not to pick up a gun that gives the mayor enough courage to take on the gang, stalling for enough time for the sheriff to perform what he needs to, or the other real hero, the secret protagonist that I'm not going to name, even with spoilers. It is Moosburger who chooses the brawling tactics in the dramatic fight scene between the sheriff and the gang of clowns that ultimately allows good to triumph over evil. Moosburger keeps his word when other, unnamed characters do not. For despite the surface of schlock in Saturday afternoon action movies upon which, by declaration of the author, this story is based, zombies, psychopathic clowns, western cryptids of a menacing variety, anthropomorphic simians, etc., deeper and more interesting themes manage to creep in nonetheless. There's a consistency of imagery and setting that only someone whose soul has gone to dwell in town for a while, or days, or weeks at a time, can truly manifest. To me, from a literary perspective, the billboard of the Laughing Cowboy, rotting away in all his mocking glory, is no different than that found in The Great Gatsby with its accusatory menacity. Yes, that's a word I just made up. Magic, the appropriateness of oaths, loves, what love is, the physicality therein, tragedy, loss, sacrifice, honor, betrayal, friendship, bravery, and humanity itself are all covered within its pages. But it is also popcorn-munching fun. And as I say at the end, just read the damn thing. Better yet, buy it. That's one of the better reviews I've written, so I'm going to leave that to speak for itself. And then the third book I'm going to speak about is Shadow Path by William Maxwell, who is also a friend of mine and also is available on Amazon. That book in particular, so I think the summary, the thumbnail of that book is that there is a man who is wanted by the police for a series of seemingly supernatural murders, who is being investigated by an occult expert who gets in over her head. And I think, honestly, again, this book can only properly be done if there are spoilers. So, spoilers. Initially, it is very unclear whether or not supernatural elements are involved. But really, after only about 3 or 4 chapters, it's obvious that not only are supernatural elements involved, but that they are very unique and very interesting ones. I think the thing that really stood out to me for this book, and the reason I'm mentioning it, well, 2 things. First of all, the original reason I read it is because apparently there is a fascist person that does not like my friend who has been harassing him and has been deliberately writing bad reviews of the book. So if you're not a fan of fascists, by all means, do what I did. Download the book, read it, review it, give it an honest review, and the more reviews it has, the more you're messing with a fascist, which is, again, why I'm putting this here. But the other thing that stood out to me is, as someone who at one point had the equivalent of probably an associate's and maybe arguably a bachelor's in religious studies due to my own personal studies and also the mandatory religious classes at BYU and their institute program, I've picked up, plus my interest in gaming and fiction and everything else, I've picked up a pretty large knowledge of the occult over time. And it's obvious that William, or Bill as I know him, did a really good job on his research. He obviously, I looked up some of the things in it, and some of them are in fact real, and some of them he just made up out of whole cloth. And like all the best urban fantasy writers, he does a very good job of creating his own mythology based on the real occult while exploring ramifications that are very interesting. I think, Bill, for a lot of different reasons, has interests in Native American lore and shamanism. And when you combine that with the elements of Christian mythology that come up in the book, it creates a very unique flavor. There's a sequel that I need to read, and once I read it, we'll probably also review here just to help Bill and also to screw with the fascist. But, I really enjoyed it. It's a little slow at first, to be honest, but it picks up really fast, and I really enjoyed that book. So I could end here, but I think, actually, I think I am going to end here. I had originally intended to choose 6 of these to talk about 3 for other people and 3 of mine, but I'll talk about my own novels in another one of these, maybe if I decide to review something else. So again, to summarize, that is Anchor by Scott Gurney, High Midnight by Rob Mosca, and Shadow Path by William Maxwell. I can't recommend them enough.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Read The Bed Springs Guy by Gary C. McAuley, winner of Best New Fiction 2018. Prose is concise and well written, and the suspense keeps building. This is an excellent piece of work, according to Susan Clayton Goldner. Quote, a serious comic crime caper. Look for it online at Amazon, Nook, eCentral, that's ESENTRAL, and PayHip.
Copyright
for this podcast is 2019.
Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!